And we're on. Well, good
We're on.
morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I actually, we're approaching noon and I have not had dinner from yesterday night yet. So that's how insane my week has been.
That's not acceptable.
So at some point, acceptability really just has to do with what you not so much accept, but tolerate. And I just seem to continue to tolerate the madness and sort of scheduling disorders.
Well, tolerance is a very important value in liberal society, to tolerate the other. We don't really like you, but we'll tolerate you.
That's correct. I mean, actually, one of my favorite lines is from a Cuban singer called Silvio Rodriguez, which everybody should know. I learned a lot of politics from him, even if in the end, I probably just, straight to the right. He's still a staunch communist sort of believer in the revolution and so on. But he has a line that I like a lot, which is that tolerance is the passion of the inquisitor. I think it's absolutely, yeah. I mean, Spanish songwriters, as opposed to most English songwriters, bar Leonard Cohen, really could do and produce a lot of this kind of literary gems. This one is particularly good because it appeals to the idea of the magnanimity and brutality of the one that tolerates. Right? Toleration is, there is something sort of ugly about it, but I like the line a lot. In any case, I tolerate really completely crazy scheduling. As you know, I interviewed this week the president of Sri Lanka for Deutsche Welle, which was a very rough interview. It will be out tomorrow, and I spent pretty much entire weekend working on that. Nonetheless, I did manage.
Looking forward to the exciting exchange you had with him.
There was a lot of shouting on his part. There was a lot of finger wagging, sort of an insane amount of finger wagging. And I was told in so many ways that I was really just not up to the task. And most of my information was wrong. In fact, I mean, the interesting thing about talking to him is that for anybody that follows at all Sri Lanka, everything is fine and dandy in that corner of the world. So
that's what I hear. There's nothing to worry about.
Exactly. Nothing is going on. But nonetheless, I did get to, keep up with the Slovakian elections, which have gone tits up, as they like to say in the Americas. And, the rest of the European circus, which just keeps rolling. I mean, I think that this is really quite a good thing. So what are we up to this week?
Well, before we get to the EU borders, let's go to borders further away. And my big question for you, Martin, is France having another Indochina moment, this time, though, in not its former Asian colonies, but its former African colonies?
It's a very good question. It does look like it, as they pulled completely out of Niger, as the Niger government has pretty much managed to dig in. The French have pulled out troops, and the French have pulled out their diplomatic corps. And the line that is being kind of pushed around is that, France has essentially lost its former colonies. The footprint is being erased, essentially. I have my very serious doubts, to tell you the truth. I mean, true, at this point, Gabon, Niger, and so on have moved away. But the problem is that on the other side of that equation, what you have are very shady operators, which in many cases are essentially working cahoots with, essentially Russian interests. And I mean, I don't know that there is any example at all of these things ever going well. So I think that West Africa, to a large degree, the Sahel included, are caught between, a Russian and a French place. So I don't really foresee that this will actually bring any stability. It's just a matter of waiting for the next cycle of political implosion that I think will bring the French and European powers. Keep in mind that when it comes down to, and I think that this really is the key, when it comes down to foreign aid and injections of cash and essentially the building of companies, if the Chinese are not there, and then the only other candidates are Americans and Europeans. So yes, they would like to sing the song of independence, of freedom, and sticking it to the man, whoever the man is. But I think that they are all completely dependent in that part of the world, as well as in other parts of the world, on American and European money. And European money and American money, political cost. Sooner or later, I think everybody finds this out. Also, the fact is that given the sort of security and stability in many of these places, sooner or later, the muscle of NATO-allied forces will be welcome, because you could end up with sort of all sorts of things that the Russians are not capable of stemming, running wild in the region. So the very long answer can be reduced to no. I don't think that this is an Indochina moment.
But still doesn't look so great for France. Yet I like this, you mentioned cyclical. I think cyclical is really important. I feel like, especially in the media, but also foreign policy observers of all kinds, including people whose job it is to set the policy, really have these amnesia moments and get so focused on the moment that they forget that there is a cycle, that there is no all-powerful, chess player who's going to, win the game, so to speak, that it's constantly cyclical. Like France is having an embarrassing moment now. Russia seems to be ascendant, but things will come back again, especially since I think specifically US influence of things like the IMF and the World Bank, which are incredibly influential in places like West Africa, is not going anywhere. No. So things look not so great from a French perspective now, but that doesn't mean things won't change in 6 months or a year. I mean, you can even look, just go back to the summer where, Wagner Group was all powerful, or until the summer, this all-powerful group kind of acting as an extension of Russian interests all around the world, but specifically in Africa. And now who knows what's going to happen with Wagner Group, if Russia can even maintain its security interests or, meddle in affairs in these far-flung places without Wagner Group and being bogged down in Ukraine. So I think it's always important, exactly as you say, it's important to note the cyclical nature of these things that come around. China is another example, ascendant China on its path, on an unending, unstoppable path to world domination, now having economic issues and people seriously questioning whether it can really dominate the way a lot of people fear. So cyclical, I think, is the name of the game.
I think that the China point is very important. It almost operates like sort of, a canary in the coal mine, so to say. I mean, if you look at the case of Sri Lanka, which of course right now I've been paying a lot of attention to, there were massive promises of investment, and then all of a sudden the Chinese disappeared. And then their entire swaths, including sort of massive developments, for instance, in the port of Colombo, which are pretty much had been left out sort of as deserted spots. So, Africa, West Africa in particular, which is much more distant and offers sort of fewer possibilities, Niger has a particular sort of issue around energy, right? So Niger has sort of, has a lot more to offer in terms of raw material. We discussed this in relation to European nuclear powers and nuclear energy. But the fact is that, China does really not seem like a reliable partner. So there is no time in the future at which any of these countries in Africa or beyond will not need an injection of money, investment, technological development, etc. So
yeah, I mean, say what you want about the U.S. and Western liberal allies of the U.S. For good or for bad or for evil or for worse, they do tend to stick around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't need to be clean. It's just they tend to stick around. Anyhow, let's move to the closer borders, because things have gotten a bit out of hand, as you know, right at the very edge, not yet inside Europe, but Nagorno-Karabakh, the next stop on our way to Europe, no longer has apparently an Armenian population. So essentially, the enclave has pretty much disappeared, capitulated to the Azerbaijanis, and then there is now essentially an Azeri majority. The government, the Armenian associated government, dissolved itself, and there's been a complete evacuation, or almost complete evacuation, of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. So the most interesting piece of story here is the sudden change of hearts of Armenia, which until very, very recently as you might remember, was very close to the Kremlin. Even though they did not get weapons from the Kremlin as the war broke out 2 years ago or so, I think that they still stayed in this sort of ambiguous relation, thinking that at one point or other things would get better. And they did not. So one of the things we heard is that the Americans had been invited to participate with the Armenian army in military exercises, which is a very small and incredibly underreported story, but with massive, massive implications, because it shows actually that the Caucasus has now a potential major redrawing of the security architecture. So that story for me was actually a really remarkable one, and a really very big one as well.
But is it too so? But if you would think if the U.S. military is aiding and training the Armenians, they would have a better shot against defending themselves against the Azerbaijanis. Is it just a case of too little, too late?
I think this would not have any impact. I mean, I think on the conflict, and I think that the Nagorno-Karabakh sort of opportunity for a negotiated settlement, essentially Nagorno-Karabakh is an island inside Azerbaijani territory. So this was not even a discussion. This should have been basically a perfectly good way for Azerbaijan to show to the world they're truly universalist, ecumenical and tolerant, again, that word, tolerant side. They just completely fucked the opportunity, and they just went, completely sort of nationalist into the territory. Of course, this has been a very, very long-standing conflict, but the fact is that this should have been, as one of my friends and boss, really, Tim Sebastian likes to say. I mean, it's very easy to do big word politics. Everybody knows that politics is tough, and it gets done in the negotiating table. That never happened. So what we have now is essentially an ethnic cleansing. I think that what the Americans—
That's the word.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, I think it was sort of people escaping. Obviously, this was not, the Azerbaijanis coming in and killing and sweeping, but what the Armenians in the area saw coming was frightening enough that they decided to essentially up and go. I think that what the Americans bring to the table is a very, very clear and present danger for the Russians in the area, because they actually have now a foothold. And this changes things, I think, fairly radically. The Armenian U.S. exercise, I mean, is a 10-day exercise called Eagle Partner. There you go. I mean, I think that's really quite a.
I love these names. I love the names for the military. I love military operations names. I love military training exercise names. They're just so blusterous and bombastic. Yeah, you gotta love them.
Eagle Partner is just a lovely little thing, which seems like a little message sent directly to the Kremlin. And to be sure, I mean, this is not going to be a massive movement of troops. These are 85 American, operational troops and 175 Armenians. So this is by no means a flexing of muscle. This is much rather a sort of, a very succinct telegram sent to the Kremlin. We're here, and buckle up. So I think,
I mean, you could see a pathway where the U.S. does in Armenia what Russia ended up doing in Syria, essentially, to the chagrin and really to the detriment of Western powers that were at first, against Bashar al-Assad and trying to get him out, but then there were so many competing factions, and enemy's enemy is your friend. And things got so horrifically messy in Syria, but Russia ended up kind of being on top in that regard. You could see it would be in a different way, of course, and hopefully not at all to the amount of just destruction that we saw to the civilian population. But you could from a geopolitical perspective, you could see that happening in Armenia.
Right. I think that's true. I mean, the 10-day exercise, I think it was completed on the 20th of September or thereabout. I mean, essentially what it does is puts on the ground a mark. And obviously, if this turns into some sort of even semi-permanent presence of Americans on Armenian territory, it also sends the message that if you're going to start walking west from Azerbaijan, what you're very likely are going to find yourself in front of American troops. And if you actually open fire on those American troops, then immediately you're going to be... So in a sense, it has a very strong preventive, or as Brits like to say, preventative, function. I think that this is actually a very, very big story, and it's one that I will continue tracking.
Anytime American troops are showing up somewhere, even in small numbers, it does indicate something bigger going on beneath the surface. And of course, it's about pressure in regards to Ukraine. I think we talked about this last week. If Russia is forced in any way to divert resources from its Ukrainian front to elsewhere in what it considers its sphere of influence, it's sort of an indirect chess move to support Ukraine, because I think it's becoming increasingly clear that Ukraine is not going to fully defeat Russia. No amount of arms and support from the West to Ukraine is going to be able to truly push Russia out. So this could be a move to just put more pressure on Russia, so that maybe at some point, in some indeterminate amount of time, Russia just can't maintain its presence in Ukraine due to pressures elsewhere.
Right.
So it could actually be a very smart geopolitical move for the United States to say, okay, we can't directly force them out of Ukraine, so we're going to, distract them and put the pressure on somewhere else. Which, just the last point, is also interesting, given that one of the major motivations for Putin to move into Ukraine the way it has is because of Putin's sense that the U.S. and Western interests, notably NATO, were pushing too far into what it considers its sphere of influence. Well, basically, this is the U.S. doubling down and saying, oh, you don't like us near Ukraine? How about near you in Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Exactly. So, I think that this is something that has been pointed out to me by a military strategist a few months ago as we were researching a story for a conflict zone, which was that one of the biggest mistakes that NATO has made, and particularly the US has made, and of course there are all sorts of doubts as to the Trump administration's even capacity or sufficient foresight to do it, but was not really pushing the Russians, but just forcing them to divert military resources. So really just flyovers, come very close to the border, move troops in the south, sort of do stuff near Lithuania, et cetera, et cetera. So it would basically push them to have to deploy things in areas when they normally would not have to deploy. The sense is that they were given way too much leeway. I think that this is a correction, of course. What is interesting to me about this particular story is that we're talking about 85 American, troops.
Right.
So it's very, 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 very tiny. But quite evidently, it looms very, very large on an area that has been thoroughly dominated, essentially by Russian influence. Should we move to the next story?
I think there's a perfect, albeit unfortunate, bridge, which is essentially what we're seeing in this area between Armenia and Azerbaijan is ethnic cleansing through the back door. As you said, it's not like the Azerbaijanis are coming in and slaughtering people and pushing people over the border, but it is a kind of ethnic cleansing through the back door. When ethnic cleansing was happening in the Balkans in the 90s, it was enough to get U.S. intervention, and both diplomatically and militarily. And we just don't see that now. And there's just not ethnic cleansing, whether through the front door or the back door, just doesn't have the same moral weight that it maybe once did. And there are just so many crises everywhere. But those tensions in the Balkans from the 90s are still very much with us. And that is something the EU is contending with.
I think that
as it still tries to bring in or think about whether it wants to bring in some of the Balkan states into the EU.
I think this is true, but I think that it's also worth mentioning that, what we had in the Balkans was not merely ethnic cleansing, meaning this was not Tochnit Dalet, in Israel, where they were actually going into towns and, just transferring people, or were scaring them by, operations, and then people were standing up and running. We're talking about really genocide is what we saw in Srebrenica, what we saw in the Balkans. So I think that that's a significant difference. I think it is true, nonetheless, that what we have here was very clearly something that was going to end up blooming into the dark flower of ethnic tension, and whoever was going to be the loser, was going to be losing in sort of an historically relevant way, right? I mean, the kind of things that 20 years later we say, how the hell did we let that happen? To this point, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that we have essentially a humanitarian catastrophe that is the product of lack of sufficient care, once again, for the question of, the integrity of ethnic minorities.
Right.
There is nothing nice about this story, to be quite honest. But yes. Anyhow, I think we should
But
just
look, but looking at applying those same concepts to what has happened in the Balkans and what is still happening in the Balkans, I find it, again, speaking of like spheres of influence and Russian involvement, I'll never forget when the U.S. was launching its campaign against Serbia in 1999. There was this big question of how and to what extent would the Russians get involved. There was this sort of division of Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. And for a very short time, Pristina was almost looking like post-war Berlin, where you had various, sectors of control between the Western allies in one part, the NATO peacekeeping force, and the Russians on the other. Would the Russians try to push in to extend their pro-Russian, views? Obviously, they're pro-Russian views. They're Russia. Their own, to extend their own interests. I remember there being a lot of coverage about this and trying to find this post-Cold War back in 1999. This, is this a repeat of tensions between the West and now Russia, former Soviet Union, but now in the form of Kosovo? Or is this somehow that, bringing Russia into the Western fold? I think we've seen how all that's turned out 20, 30 years later. But I'm speaking in generalities. Martin, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about these renewed old tensions in Serbia and Kosovo and how that plays into EU accession talks.
I think that your point is actually very, very interesting, because it's not only a question of the NATO operation sort of affecting the Russian perception, the NATO operation in the Balkans affecting the Russian perception of NATO. But I think that it's one of the things that to me is very interesting, and I travel in the Balkans quite a bit, actually, especially Serbia. It's really quite interesting to see that even very liberal Serbians who are completely opposed to Vucic, completely opposed to sort of, jingoist approach to Serbianness, etc. I mean, they still are people that have very unpleasant feelings about NATO. I mean, many of them were sitting underneath the bombs. They were completely opposed to Milosevic back then, and were sitting underneath the bombs as NATO was flying over and dropping things in the center of town. So I think that this is the reason why when now today we find ourselves, and this brings us really to the next story, which is there's been essentially this sorry. It's alive, so these things are bound to happen.
Bound to happen.
Exactly.
It's how we know you're alive. It's live. We know you're alive.
Indeed. So far, so good. So, I mean, there was basically a major confrontation. A group of Serbian Kosovars took over a town after a confrontation with the police, in which one Kosovar police agent died. And these people were actually understood to be, because the tensions between Kosovo and Serbia had been heightened for at least a year and a half now. We're actually in Serbia last summer, and we were actually around August thinking of canceling our trip precisely because things have heated up very, very radically at the border. Nothing happened. Things sort of de-escalated. But sort of the tensions and these sort of hotspots are happening constantly. Now there has actually been a massive cache of weapons found among a group of people that essentially took over a town and found their last stand, so to say, inside a monastery. So it is the case that when you actually talk to, I think that a lot of the Serbian population, even in people that are very liberal, are not really completely on board with the story that we tell about sort of Balkan independence and the question of Kosovo and the place of Bosnia-Herzegovina and so on and so forth.
Right. I mean, it's important to remember that Kosovo is an internationally recognized breakaway republic from Serbia that was a product of that 1999 NATO assault on Milosevic in Serbia, but it is not recognized by Russia, by China, by all the players in the room that stand to oppose the West.
So I think that this is actually a very, very, very relevant point, because this is also one of the places in which countries like Serbia, which have this sort of resentment, and I want to make sure that I want to make this clear. I mean, I think that for a Serbian civilian that has seen sort of, an epidemic of cancers that are very likely related, and this has been the argument, and there's been quite a bit of stuff written about it, with sort of the type of munition that was used during the war. Obviously, their sense about NATO, I mean, is that NATO is actually a criminal organization. When you actually see the Kosovo situation, and you actually see the Bosnian situation, but in the case of Kosovo, you see the Russians essentially backing up Serbia and saying, well, no, this is not an independent, we do not recognize. And China, in a sense, they become immediately allies that are sort of Ukraine.
Yeah, not too much unlike, your enemy's enemy is your friend, not too much unlike what we're seeing in Western Africa, where you have these regimes taking over, tapping into anti-French and, more broadly speaking, anti-Western imperial sentiment, and turning towards China and Russia for support, just because, not necessarily because they love Russia and China, but it's just a foil against their former imperial overlords. You're seeing in different ways, of course, but broadly speaking, very similar sentiments playing out right on the doorstep of the European Union.
I mean, it's an important point, and it shows sort of a certain amount of geopolitical incompetence by powers that actually are operating in these areas and either take for granted the loyalty or think that there is actually no chance of a segue out of those political positions. Very much a case of essentially Francophone Africa now straying away from Europe, and very much the case of the Balkans, essentially, who I have had people in Serbia who told me, we were living under a dictatorship, we were trying to get rid of Milosevic, then came the US and in the name of democracy bombed us.
Right.
So I think that this kind of thing is something that in the long game has huge repercussions, and they are still either not seen or understood, or simply not of interest. So in any case, I mean, the situation in Serbia and Kosovo, I think it's very, very volatile. They've been toying at the border. The Americans have now asked as Belgrade, as Vucic, to pull away its troops from the Kosovo border. The Americans have become very interested in the region, so obviously, much like in Armenia, much like along the NATO border. They know that these are politically contested areas. And I think that this is a story that we're going to be looking at for sort of quite a bit of time to come.
Right. So, and this all comes against the backdrop of this. This is a years-long discussion about bringing some of these Balkan countries into the EU as full-fledged members, which is heating up again this week as the EU leaders are talking about how to reform the bloc, what reforms are necessary before they can allow more enlargement, and what would enlargement look like as it goes into a major meeting of leaders next week in Spain.
Indeed. So I think that there is sort of a question that it always comes back to haunt the European Union, and perhaps the best example is Turkey. But Serbia is a very good example as well, and you can see it in Hungary, and to a large degree, you can also see it in Poland. Poland might be politically very far from Russia, but ideologically, they're essentially twins. So the Kremlin and the PIS, we have discussed this, in many, many ways really belong in the same political family. And I think that the thing that sort of Europe understood with the Turkey candidacy, I mean, truncated Turkey candidacy, but then with the acceptance of Turkey and Hungary and so on, is that these countries are in some sense extremely dangerous, because they actually can become fifth columns for very anti-European value forces within the European operation. As a matter of fact, I mean, it might be really too late at this stage, as we're seeing more and more European sort of internal sort of core members turning farther and farther and farther to this sort of strange pro-Putin or Putinophilic or Putino-friendly wing. Yeah. So over the weekend, actually, I mean, between yesterday and today, the country went back into this pro-Russian FICO alliance. Is essentially a political party of the far right. I mean, a populist far right, which has actually made very clear statements of allegiance to not allegiance, but I mean it's friendliness to the Kremlin. So I think that the question of reform has been on the table for a very long time. But the problem is that you have to keep in mind that European law and decision making very often requires unanimity. And there's simply no way that in this state of affairs, where the far right is actually really trying to get a handle on the European institutional framework altogether and the upper hand, that there is any chance that there really will be agreement on essentially restructuring either law, institution, or political outlook. I think that this
it's hard to see how people don't like giving up power. I mean, you see this at the UN Security Council. For as much as the United States wants to talk about, equality and everyone having a seat at the table, there's no way anyone's going to give up their veto power. And it's hard to see how that would happen in a European context. Anybody willing to give up their veto power in a move towards just majority rule, basically. But nonetheless, it also paralyzes EU policymaking and moving forward on some of these major questions. I think what you brought up a really good point about, how can the EU possibly be considering bringing in more countries on this periphery whose political stability is unknown, whose adherence to the certain kinds of liberal values and democratic values that the EU purports to stand for, at least internally inside the bloc, how they can really think about that. When in their own bloc, they don't have their own house in order, specifically Poland and Hungary. And this especially connects also to not just the Balkans, but of course, the big question is Ukraine. Ukraine wants to basically jump to the front of the line saying, hey, we are your number one friend and partner and ally. We're the ones who are fighting your war against Russia. We are fighting the good fight and we deserve to be part of the EU. And according to the Ukrainians, they've hit all of the seven prerequisites that the EU has laid out for them to meet candidate status. But I have a lot of concerns about this project being rushed. I'm all for, let's expand the EU. Great. Like, who doesn't like more of a single market and more trade and more ability to travel and all the things that the EU brings us? But doing things too quickly, too fast, too ham-fisted, and not really thinking things through. I can imagine a horror scenario where, sure, Ukraine looks pro-Western and friendly and liberal and working on fighting corruption and fighting the good fight against Russia today. But as we were talking about earlier about the cyclical nature of things, there's nothing to say that Ukraine in 10 years, 15 years, depending what happens, isn't more pro-Russian. Something happens with the leadership there, something happens with local politics that have nothing to do with what's going on globally or even regionally. And you see a very different Ukraine that also is armed to the teeth with NATO and Western weapons. I guess the big question is it safer to bring such an entity that's so armed into the European and NATO fold, or keep it outside of it? What's sort of the safer, more stable action? Nonetheless, I see a repeating of mistakes if past is prologue. This was exactly the conversation happening about countries like Poland, like Hungary, elsewhere in the former Soviet bloc. Looking at it in a very black and white zero-sum kind of game where, well, these countries hated the Soviet Union. They're glad to be free. They're glad to embrace market Western liberal principles. So of course they're going to be pro-Western. Let's bring them in. And so they did. And now 20, 30 years later, you actually see a backsliding into, we love making money. But as we see in China, making money is not the same thing. And embracing capitalism is not the same thing as embracing certain anti-corruption measures, certain other kinds of liberal values. And I fear for the EU that it could be making the same mistake with Ukraine. Things look great now. All the boxes are checked, but that doesn't mean that something happens in the future because of not doing their homework today sets up for a very bad thing in the future.
I don't really think it's a matter of doing homework. I mean, I think that so there is a lot of talk, and I think that there is some wisdom to it about the question of going slowly and understanding the process. I am absolutely skeptical, and the older I become, the more conservative I become. I'm absolutely skeptical about the idea that you could turn Eastern Ukraine into a serious EU type of value system, because essentially it belongs to a completely different cultural domain. It belongs to a completely different ideation of morality and politics, which is essentially will not cease to be closer to the Kremlin. We're seeing this not only in Eastern Ukraine, we see this all the way to the border of Poland and Germany. We actually see it to the border of Berlin. Right. Yeah. We also see it in the east of Germany. So I think that the German point is that we have the brunt of the population has a certain historical memory that pushes them in the direction of supporting European values. But Poland considers itself a victim. So in a sense, Poland has the moral, Poland as a whole, I would say, clearly expressed by the PIS. The PIS would like to say this and says it regularly, that they have the moral high ground and that they can. So I think that these are, national cultures, political national cultures and institutional cultures are changed by just aspirational claims. So I think that, as Turkey has shown, as Poland has shown, as Hungary has shown, this is essentially just, bringing into question the very possibility of a European project. As a matter of fact, I mean, our big story for this week, which we're probably not going to be able to touch, extensively, is the question of essentially the collapse or the suspension of the open border system inside Europe. And this is very much sort of a product of precisely this kind of thing, right? We have now checks on the Slovakian border, have checks on the Czech border, and Germany has put also checks in the German border. There's been border issues between the German and the Poland border. There's been issues between the French and Italian border, essentially because Italy is a point of entry and France is a point of arrival on the way at least to the UK. So the French had been also controlling the border. I mean, you don't see it sort of plastered on the... It's actually happening. And it's happening precisely because a type of destabilization that is coming from migration, but also a certain form of reacting to migration. That has
right, and migrants are always a perfect, electoral foil because they don't have a vote and they don't have a voice.
Well, they're also dark. Well, they were dark until coming from Ukraine, but they were dark and they were they professed strange religions and they spoke weird languages and they ate food that was very strange and very spicy. So obviously, I mean, I think that this is we have touched on before, which is if we're seeing the collapse of these European internal mechanisms, for instance, of free movement, which for me is actually quite central to the European project, it is precisely because the discourse of migration crisis, which I think it's complete bullshit. I don't think that we have a migration crisis, but the discourse has been allowed to spread and has been now institutionalized and accepted. Right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a political crisis internal to the EU, not anything to do with the actual issue at hand.
The point I want to make is that it's an internal issue that is actually to a very large degree being built. Sorry, we have a crying baby, but it's alive, so it happens.
Good.
So,
again, like you coughing, you're alive, baby's crying, it's alive. These are good things.
Yes. So the point is that this is not just an internal issue, it's an internal issue that is built by certain political operators inside Europe, which are the ones that you're concerned about in Eastern Ukraine and that we were concerned about, but we were not talking about it in Poland and in Hungary and in Slovakia and in the Czech Republic. So all of this thing that was potentially a fifth column, ideological fifth column inside the European Union is now fully operational and deployed. This is my point.
And exactly, and that's to my point. And then to continue to keep committing to the same inputs and thinking there's going to be different outputs is insanity. Why would you repeat these mistakes? The writing was on the wall. all those years ago, that they hadn't done their homework, as I like to say. They ignored, the liberal bias and the liberal blind spot that somehow the Fukuyama, liberalism will triumph. This is the way to run human civilization. Everybody will see the light, and that's the end of history. Has completely screwed the liberal project.
I think that what you also have is sort of this sort of very stupid and blindsided left-wing supposition, which is that the victim is always with me ideologically, which is clearly nonsense. I mean, it was nonsense for, Catholic Poles that were oppressed by Soviet machinery. We're never going to be essentially, good illuminated left-wing liberals who embrace feminism. It's just nonsense.
Yeah.
And I think that this was part of the presumption. Look, we need to slowly wrap it up because this week we had been through a lot, but I wanted to ask you, what is that you think we have exciting coming this in the next few days?
Well, exactly this topic, right? We're having what the EU is calling an informal gathering, which kind of sounds to me like a spring break vacation of state leaders of the bloc in Granada, Spain, where they're going to be talking about, so they say, all of these issues. I don't know if they're going to come to any conclusions or solutions or policy points or anything, but they're going to be discussing enlargement, EU reform, and the internal problems, like we said, the problems on the borders, all of these three, kind of the trifecta, border issues internally, migration, and enlargement, and what has to happen. I think there's broad agreement that in the EU that it would like to expand. It would like to have more members, but there's no agreement on how that happens, when it happens, and what has to happen before that happens. Mm-hmm. And the big thing being discussed, and probably will be more discussed next week, is what an EU can look like without more EU members, what they're calling concentric circles, where you're going to have like a core EU, and then you'll have partners of the EU, and you'll have friends of the EU, and these different layers of sort of EU-ness.
Program for the EU. It's fantastic.
You can send your donations to Brussels anytime. So that's going to be probably the big story coming up next week that I see in terms of these issues.
What I'm going to be actually looking at, probably at least at the beginning of the week, is what is the upshot of the Slovakian election, where you actually have a return to. You have a return, not only you have a return to a really rather strange right-wing, formation, which has been in power. I mean, interestingly enough, Fico, who was actually the leader, the head of state of Slovakia, had to step down because of the murder of a journalist, in which the relation of the government to that episode was not completely clear. So the way that he went out was actually in complete political dejection by the standards of Europe, in any case. And he's somebody that has already said that he will basically side with Russia, that there will be no more movement of weapons to Ukraine. The fact is that Slovakia seems to have absolutely nothing else to offer Ukraine other than contracts that Ukraine has already granted Slovakia. So if he really were to cut that off, that would mean that he would be leaving a lot of people out of jobs. But I think that the bigger story with Slovakia is that this is one more player, one more figure in the European machine that stands on the side of Meloni, Orban, the PIS, Le Pen, and Vox, which I would like you to ask me now, what do I think is the most successful political brand in Europe today?
What is the most successful political brand in Europe today?
Well, the most successful political brand in Europe today is Bannonism. Steve Bannon has actually made a killing on this side of the Atlantic. While everybody was playing with their little cell phones, quite clearly the machinery was being built, and we're now seeing, I think, in really stark clarity, we're seeing essentially these figures popping up and taking position in a lineup that, again, moving towards like the 2024 election in the European Union, will become actually a really important and very dangerous force in my mind. The other story is, for me, for this week, is internal to Italy, whereas everybody continues to celebrate, Meloni being the first woman, something or other. She's also has purged essentially the Italian cultural apparatus from opposition. Old style, party line, fascism, back on the table. So people she doesn't like that have criticized her, opposition, people that belong to quarters that she disagrees with, have now been flushed out of not just televisions and radios and publications, but museums, universities are beginning to see this kind of thing. It's absolutely frightening, in addition to the fact that she's essentially hunting down gay families and sort of taking absolutely unpalatable positions in relation to migration and whatnot. I think that this is something that I encourage everybody to keep a very close, eye on, because it's becoming uglier and uglier and uglier as feminists across the pond are sort of pink-washing her, and pro-Ukrainian voices are actually praising her for supporting Zelensky. What is happening in there is really quite ugly. In any case, not that I want to cut this off, but I have to cut this off because time has come to go.
And I still hear a baby crying, so I think you should go take care of that.
Still crying. He is with the grandmother, but the grandmother who has come to visit us is not succeeding the way I can. So I do need
some Martin reinforcements.
Indeed. It's been lovely to see you again.
As always.
The conversation again. We're gonna not promise, but we're gonna try to bring. I have an idea for a very interesting guest for next week. So we'll see if we manage to actually get that on.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
Excellent. Talk to you soon.
See you.
Take good care. Bye.